Estamos no ar.
Okay.
Podemos retornar.
Yes.
Good afternoon and good evening to some of you. My name is Fabiana, and I am one of the organizers of this event, and I am very happy to open the first roundtable. I would like to review some of our instructions to the presenters, the debater, and the listeners. The presenters will have up to 20 minutes to deliver their talk. I will not interrupt any of you, but I will use the chat to remind you when you have 5 minutes left to finish your presentation, so please pay attention to that. As we informed in the email you received yesterday, you can share your screen if you wish to use any supporting material for your presentation. We ask the presenters to turn on the radio only before their talk. After the 5 presentations, I will invite Professor Michela Bordignon to open and lead the debate. I would like to seize the opportunity to introduce her to you. Professor, say hi to everybody. She's a professor at the Federal University of ABC in São Paulo. She has already read the papers and prepared some comments. She will read her comments after the 5 presentations. And each presenter will have 5 minutes to reply to her comments. Unfortunately, that's the time we have. After the debate, we will open the roundtable for discussion with our audience from the YouTube channel. The viewers will then be able to make questions to the presenters and, if they wish, to the debater. One of the organizers of the event will select these questions and send them to me. We remind you all that unfortunately this last session of the event has to be limited to 25 minutes. If we don't receive questions from our viewers, Professor Bordignon will be free to restart the discussion if she wishes. Does anybody have any question? Can we start? So I would like to welcome our first presenter, Jiahiu Feng, a doctoral student at the University of Paris I, Pantheon-Sorbonne. The title of her paper is Phenomenology of Spirit as an Introduction to Science, a Learner Paradox. Ms. Feng, you have our attention. I will use the chat to talk to you, okay?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay. Firstly, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizing community for giving me the opportunity to present my work. And in this presentation, I'm majorly concerned with Hegel's philosophical system and its phenomenology, and by drawing some light from ancient philosophy. And I would appreciate it if you could leave any questions at the discussion session. So let's start. I will share my PowerPoint. Excuse me for a second. I will try to. I'm sorry, but I think that I cannot share the PowerPoint. Just one second.
Fabiana, could you show the text?
You can, Ms. Feng, you can click present now on your right. Present now. and then you can click on your entire screen,
Okay.
and then you will find the video, the screen. You click
Yes.
on the screen,
Yes.
and then you click share. But you have to have your text on a tab so we can see your text.
Okay. It seems that there are some problem of the general. Okay, just for because that functions. Fabiana, can you
Yes.
show the PowerPoint for me if I send the text to you?
Yes, I can do that. I will ask one of the organizers to do that. Would you do that, Paulo, please?
Okay, just a few seconds. I don't know how it's. Yes, I have sent the
okay.
email to your email. But for I will not waste time for this
No
anymore.
problem at all.
Okay.
It's Feng.
Okay.
Can I suggest
Yes.
something? We can jump to the second presentation, and then Paulo will work on your document, and then we can come back to your presentation at the end of the roundtable. Is it possible?
You mean skip my term or just because I think I can do without it.
Yes, you can do it. You can do
Okay.
without the document. No problem at
Okay.
all, as you wish.
Because I made some change to my full text. So
Okay.
okay. So let's start it.
Okay.
The maturity of Hegel's philosophy was marked by the publication of the Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807, abbreviated as Phenomenology as thereafter. This work is not only premier in terms of chronological sequence, but of logical order as well. Hegel constitutes it to be the introduction to his philosophy, that is to say, the first part of his system. As the endpoint of the system, phenomenology is considered to be the overall presentation of what is science, universal truth, or absolute knowledge. Furthermore, as an introduction, it undertakes the project of justification, that is, Rechtfertigung. In other words, the philosopher cannot be satisfied with merely setting out what is science or truth is, or else the project would be a dogmatic one, vulnerable to criticism from skeptics. So phenomenology plays the role of cultivation, as it has the function of elevating the natural consciousness to the scientific position. It is constructed to be the mediator between natural consciousness and absolute knowledge, which makes Hegel's philosophical framework not particular and dogmatic, but universal and true. However, this meditation is questionable in two senses. First, as a presentation of emerging science, phenomenology seems to presuppose already what constitutes veritable science. Second, the task of phenomenology is to present the inherent flaws of natural consciousness, to lead the latter to the authentic form of philosophy. But this persuasion might only be an external one. It seems that the relation between phenomenology and the scientific system falls into a learner's paradox, which is illustrated uh, in Plato's Meno. That is to say, we are unable to inquire into things that we know nothing about at all, and we have no need to inquire into things we know already. Either way, there seems to be no possibility for the space of learning. So, how to deal with this learner's paradox? In order to explicate in the introductory role of phenomenology, let us turn to the basic theoretical structure of the work. Here I cite the Phenomenology of Hegel, the paragraph 77. Now, because this exposition, that is Darstellung, has for its objects only knowing as it appears, that is erscheinendes Wesen, it does not itself seem to be the science which is free and self-moving within its own proper shape, but from this standpoint can instead to be taken to be the path, Weg, of natural consciousness, pressing forward toward true knowing. In this paragraph, Hegel develops a crucial distinction between Darstellung, that is the present exposition exerted by the phenomenologist, and the Weg, the path which refers to the experience of natural consciousness. So, phenomenology is a project of exposition. It has the object as the appearing knowing, that is to say, the natural consciousness which develops into a series of forms. Therefore, Hegel's phenomenology, if it is to fulfill its task as an introduction, should at first reveal the inherent flow of each form of consciousness, so that every stage of consciousness has to develop itself to another stage and culminate finally in absolute knowledge. And this is the function of Darstellung. Furthermore, the movement from one form of consciousness to another should not be imposed or discovered by chance, but must be the inevitable result of the movement of consciousness. That is to say, Darstellung should be internal to the Weg. The exposition of various forms of natural consciousness is to be identical to the movement of consciousness itself. This is made possible, according to Hegel, by his characterization of the self-examination of consciousness. According to Hegel, consciousness has two aspects. First, it is the relational aspect in which the object and consciousness are related to each other. And second is the differential aspect, which means that the object is not related to consciousness. The first is called being for consciousness, in German, für es. The second being in itself, in German, an sich. According to Hegel, an sich signifies truth as well, for it means that there is something out of the reach of consciousness. Because of this, being in itself constitutes the measure of consciousness. Based on the above established analysis, the movement of consciousness is its self-examination, which deploys itself according to the for it in itself, für es and an sich structure. This activity runs through two levels of consciousness. On the one hand, consciousness is the examiner, and on the other hand, it is the examined, oscillating between its relational aspect and its differential aspect. Examining consciousness discovers inconsistency between its in itself and for it, and has to adjust its knowledge. What is previously held to be being in itself is in fact being for consciousness. The knowledge of consciousness changes, and at the same time, the object, that is, its being itself, also changes. Due to an internal inversion of the consciousness, it advances into a new relational stage. All these transformations takes place within the self-examining activity of the consciousness. Inspired by the work of Klages, I draw a chart to illustrate this process, but unfortunately, I cannot present my PowerPoint, so I try to describe this briefly. At the first stage, consciousness is faced with an object which is an sich and constitutes its truth. And then consciousness realizes that the object which it had thought to be in itself and outside the relation to consciousness is actually within the relation and exits for the sake of consciousness. Namely, the object is, as a matter of fact, being for consciousness. This process refers to the reversal of consciousness, and it is described by Hegel a reflection of consciousness in itself. In other words, what is an sich is in fact an an sich that is für es. The differential aspect is incorporated into the relational aspect. Furthermore, this being for consciousness of being in itself constitutes a new form of being in itself, and that which means an advanced truth. This new being in itself is the negation of the previous an sich and at the same time the self-denial of the previous one. And then appears the second stage of consciousness. According to this dynamic motivated by the für es and an sich structure, the consciousness is the examiner and examined at the same time. In this vein, the demand of phenomenology, that is to say, the identification of Darstellung and Weg, is guaranteed. However, the complexity of this issue lies in the fact that this account of self-examination, that is to say, the interiority of the Darstellung, is accompanied by another perspective, that is the we as phenomenologist. Hegel's formulation at the end of the introduction of phenomenology worth noting. He says, this way of looking at the matter is something contributed by us, by means of which the succession of experiences through which consciousness passes is raised into scientific progression. But it is not known to consciousness that we are observing. The citation makes it clear that neither the inversion of consciousness nor the creation of new objects is the product of consciousness itself. Rather, it is the work of we, the phenomenologists, as expositors. Both the being in itself and the being for consciousness aspect of consciousness need to be accounted for on the basis of for us. The participation of the we seemed to draw our discussion back to the learner's paradox, because the difference between the perspective of the phenomenologist and that of consciousness rendered the interiority of the exposition untenable. That is to say, Darstellung would be a fundamental different to Weg, and the absolute knowledge is not acknowledged by consciousness but imposed from outside. So how can we solve this problem? In this work, I propose a possible solution inspired by the general structure of this work. Let us turn to the chapter Spirit, in which Hegel points out that spirit is the self-supporting absolute real essence. All the previous shapes of consciousness are abstractions from it. Consequently, we can see that the series of forms of consciousness are only abstractions of the one and unique spirit. At the ontological level, individual consciousness and universal spirit are precisely the same. Or rather, they are identical in the sense that individual is only meaningful in the context of spirit's self-differentiation and self-return. In this sense, the subject of phenomenology is not consciousness, but spirit. And that might be the reason why Hegel changes the title from Science of the Experience of Consciousness to Phenomenology of Spirit. The path of consciousness is the product of externalization of the spirit itself. The spirit deploys its otherness in order to further return to itself as a differentiated one. The counterpart of externalization of spirit is its recollection, in German, Erinnerung, which means also internalization, according to the syntax. Hegel says, in the end of this work, that in taking the inward term, spirit is absorbed into the night of its consciousness, as if all that had preceded it were lost to it, and as if it were to have learned nothing from the experience of preceding spirits. However, that inwardizing recollection has preserved that experience. It is what it is inner, and it is in fact the higher form of substance. The concept of recollection suggests that phenomenology as an introduction cannot be described simply as a bridge between a non-scientific consciousness and the scientific position. Science and natural consciousness are not distinct entities, knowledge, form of knowledge. They they present rather different stage of the development of spirit itself. Phenomenologia's exposition is in fact the path of spirit which has reached its end and retraces the stages it has passed through. Consciousness is already scientific consciousness when it embarks on the path of cultivation described in phenomenology. In this sense, phenomenology is not something that Hegel speaks to others, like a philosopher speaking to outsiders, Hegelians speaking to non Hegelians, but Hegel speaking to himself, or more precisely, the absolute reflecting to itself. Only in this sense does the movement of consciousness contain what Hegel calls necessity. And consciousness is following the path has already traveled, and doubts, the despair experiences are only traces of what he has already lived through. In such an activity in which spirit itself think about itself, individuals as finite consciousness is necessary in that these elements are aspects of differentiation allowing the spirit to be enriched and actualized. But on the other hand, finite consciousness is also insignificant because it does not contribute anything new. For Hegel says in the preface, everything is already done on its own. Do I have time or it's time to?
You still have 5 minutes, Miss Feng.
Okay, okay, thank you. I have finished the general argument of my work and have some further remarks according to this Hegel's, Hegel's framework of his phenomenology. If consciousness self-examination is the externalization and return, the movement of externalization and return of the universal spirit, and if consciousness' own progress is in fact a journey to what is already there but not yet revealed, then phenomenology is not so much about the education of the individual as it is about the self-education of the philosopher. In the end, have we not again encountered the question at the beginning? How can a learner, that is to say, finite consciousness, elevate himself to the truth, that is to say, the infinite spirit? If true knowledge is recollection and a cycle from forgetting to recollection, then it remains still a great problem concerning how one can enter into the cycle, at least for us finite subjective individuals. And that is for all of my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
We thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry if we weren't able to help you with your document. We should have checked that before we began, but I can send the other presentations and the debater your PowerPoint presentation after the event, okay? After we finish our activities of today. Thank you very much. I call now our second presenter, Emmanuel Chaput, a doctoral student at the University of Ottawa. The title of his paper is From a Letter to Emil Rung, The Functions of the Phenomenology of Spirit Within and Without Hegel's Encyclopedia. Mr. Chaput, you may begin your presentation. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
There is a certain irony, I think, in the fact that whereas for most of our contemporaries, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit constitutes his opus magnum, whereas for Hegel's own contemporaries, it's not for Hegel himself, the end of phenomenology was often seen at odds with his systematic philosophy. So John Petrie, for example, goes as far as to say that although Hegel never completely rejected the work, nor did he ever encourage anyone to take it very seriously. According to Petrie, after the publication of the Jena Phenomenology, Hegel sought to integrate his theory of consciousness in a more orderly fashion within his systematic writings, distinguishing between phenomenology proper, psychology, and then the realm of social relations, which belongs to objective spirit. What had been considered as a ladder, which allowed the reader to raise herself up to the level of philosophy, thus became a mere rung in the general economy of Hegel's system. Following this line of interpretation, the 1807 Phenomenology can be seen as a genial yet unpolished attempt to provide a philosophical account of consciousness. Because of its genius, it's still widely read today with interest, but because of its unpolished character, it would allegedly have been more or less discarded by Hegel and his students, for whom Hegel's theory of consciousness is rather to be found in the whole of the philosophy of subjective spirit in Hegel's Encyclopedia. But such an assertion should, however, be balanced by the fact that at the very end of his life, only a year after the third and last edition of the Encyclopedia, Hegel was still working on a re-edition of his 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit. This tends to show that the Jena phenomenology still retained for him a certain relevance that was not reducible to the purpose of the phenomenology as found within the Encyclopedia. Again, the idea then that against the idea then that the Encyclopedia's phenomenology kind of took over the 1807, which was initially the first part or the pathway to the system, well, I would like to consider the idea that Hegel conferred to both phenomenology distinct function instance and roles in relation to the general economy of the system, which kind of let them coexist in their own right within the general framework of the final system. So my thesis is the following. As it is well known, Hegel's Jena phenomenology can be seen as a philosophical propedeutic devoted to bringing natural consciousness up to the level of philosophical knowledge proper. As Hegel writes in My Phenomenology of Spirit, which on that account was at its publication described as the first part of the system of philosophy, the method adopted was to begin with the first and simplest phase of mind, immediate consciousness, and to show how that stage gradually of necessity worked onward to the philosophical point of view. And this aspect is well captured by Stephen Holgate when he writes that Hegel insists that philosophy or science may not expect the ordinary individual to simply give in to it. On the contrary, if science expects the individual to rise up to its level, then the individual has the right to demand that science should at least provide him with the ladder to this standpoint, should show him this standpoint within himself. Hegel's phenomenology will be that ladder. The role of the phenomenology, therefore, is not to set out Hegel's own philosophy, but to lead natural consciousness from its own certainties to the perspective of philosophy, and so to justify such philosophy in the eyes of consciousness. End of quote. This idea that the Jena phenomenology needed to be understood as a preparation, allowing the reader to bring herself to the level of philosophy, was already made plain by Hegel in 1807. It was made all the more necessary in the context of what he saw as the degrading of present-day philosophy through the pretentiousness and harmfulness of philosophical formulae. So not only can we not expect natural consciousness to be naturally inclined toward the level of reflection necessary for proper philosophy, worst, what passes for philosophy can bring them even further away from what should be philosophy in Hegel's view. As such, the task of the phenomenology is not only to immanently deconstruct the certainties, the bias, the illusion of natural consciousness, but to criticize concurrent philosophical approach which steer philosophy in the wrong direction. In both cases, the Jena phenomenology fulfills its task when it allows the reader to understand not only that no one is immediately and naturally inclined to the level of thinking which is required by philosophy, but also that properly handled, philosophy should be pursued in an Hegelian fashion. And so this is why Hegel's phenomenology is not a propedeutic to philosophy in general per se, but to Hegel's own system in the sense of philosophy. Of course, this function of the 1807 phenomenology can never be totally integrated to the Encyclopedia's phenomenology, which already presupposes the fact that natural consciousness has been brought up to the level of philosophy and the true starting point of philosophy per se, which would be the science of logic. This brings me to an interesting aside. In his dissertation, Hegel's Ontology and the Theory of Historicity, Marcuse notes that in 1807 the phenomenology appeared as the first part of the system, the second part of which was supposed to be the logic, the philosophy of nature and philosophy of spirit. In 1817, and in the final version of the larger Encyclopedia, the phenomenology is no longer the first part replaced by the logic. Instead, the phenomenology is abbreviated and essentially transformed into one section of the third part of the system, namely the philosophy of spirit. Here, Marcuse, as Heidegger, seems to adopt the perspective I tend since to criticize, according to which Hegel merely integrated this phenomenology in the encyclopedic system as a mere transitory rung. Of course, I'm not contesting that this is partly true in the sense that Hegel did indeed initially present the phenomenology as the first part of the system of science and projected a second volume which would contain the system of logic as speculative philosophy and the two further divisions of philosophy, the science of nature and spirit. While in his preface to the first edition of the Logic, he explained why this plan was not possible anymore. And by the time of the first edition of the Encyclopedia, Hegel seems to fully assume that the logic as the first part of his system. It is, however, significant that in the little work that he had done before his untimely death on the reedition of the 1807 Phenomenology, one of the things he modified in the preface is the assertion that the Jena phenomenology constituted the coming to be of science as such, or of knowledge, as the first part of the system of science. In fact, Hegel retained the idea that it is this coming to be of science or as such or of knowledge that is described by the 1807 phenomenology, but left out the idea that it constituted as such the first part of the system of science. This is interesting because it implies that while the logic constitute in 1831 the true starting point of Hegel's system, the phenomenology remains a necessary preliminary preparation for natural consciousness in order to be able to be on the level of philosophical knowledge. Its function is preserved even though its position as first part is rejected, and as such, the Jena phenomenology is not merely abbreviated and transformed into one section of the Encyclopedia, as Marcuse contends. It remains to the end for Hegel a ladder to the system. The only thing that changes is that whereas he saw earlier this ladder as being part of the system itself, he later saw it as a kind of mere propedeutic to what is really the beginning of philosophy, namely the logic. The Jena phenomenology is thus finally both a necessary gateway toward the system and at the same time something outside of it. But this is precisely, I think, the status of a ladder which allows us to access a certain level without being itself part of that level. In fact, the very etymology of the words propedeutic and encyclopedia shows this kind of ambivalent relation between the two. They both relate to paideia, the education, but whereas one is something one must learn prior to education per se, propedeutic, the other is the general or global encyclios content of education itself, the encyclopedia. So, for example, a self-taught guitar player may have to learn how to get rid or unlearn its bad habit before beginning a formal learning of the instrument in order not to be merely a guitar player, but a proper musician. In the case of philosophy, however, and even more so when one thinks of Hegel in philosophy, the idea of a necessary propedeutic may seem somewhat awkward. Indeed, if the system of philosophy consists in the immanent self-explicitation of the idea, it seems that its process is autonomous, prepositionless, and entirely coherent in itself. Um, this is why, for example, Derrida famously said that in regards to the relation between the 1807 phenomenology and the logic, one cannot assert that the former is in fact preface to the latter. Shall it be said, I quote Derrida here, this is the traditional problem, that the entire phenomenology of spirit is in fact a preface introducing the logic. It is in truth an endless postface. End of quote. It cannot be a preface, according to Derrida, because each of the two develops and presupposes the other. This is, in a sense, obvious. The logic needs and presupposes the phenomenology, which allows natural consciousness to make sense of what is going on in the logic. But of course, conversely, the phenomenology mobilizes notion and concept that are in turn only fully grounded in the logic. And this is why the phenomenology would not be a preface, which can rightfully have been written only after the fact, but a postface written from the viewpoint of absolute knowledge. This is again Derrida. Nonetheless, despite Derrida and despite Hegel's own critique of philosophical prefaces, which ironically opens his own preface to the 1807 Phenomenology. I consider that in the end, the Jena Phenomenology stand in a somewhat similar relation to a system that is analogous to the way its preface stand in relation to the Phenomenology. The fact that the Jena Phenomenology necessarily uses concepts and categories that can only be thoroughly justified within the logic or in the system as a whole, I think is not sufficient to reject its propedeutical character. It only shows that natural consciousness can not really know itself, as Socrates would say, without raising itself to the level of philosophical thinking, because it unknowingly uses conceptual categories that can, in the end, only be grounded through a philosophical explanation. In other words, the phenomenology is meant to make natural consciousness acknowledge its need for a true philosophical standpoint, which begins then with the logic. It is in fact to in, it is in fact important to preserve, I think, the ambiguity of a preface, which, as Derrida says, belong both to the inside and the outside of the concept, and is at the same time remains anterior and exterior to the development of the content it announces, because it allows us not only to understand how the 1807 phenomenology remained to the end relevant in Hegel's view, as a way to introduce natural consciousness to the necessity of a systematic approach of philosophy, it also allows us to distinguish between two phenomenology in Hegel's final system. Indeed, considering their function in relation to the system, the position they occupied in said system, and the difference in content, one could argue that there is, in fact, two distinct phenomenology in Hegel's final system. So up to now, I've mainly focused on the Jena phenomenology, of course, and I've tried to show how it retained until the end a certain relevance for Hegel. It is not integrated to the system as a subsection of philosophy of spirit, but retained its role as a propedeutic. As such, its function is distinct from the Encyclopedia's phenomenology, because, of course, it would be indeed absurd to place the gateway to the system at the very end of it. As such, the function and situation of both phenomenology in relation to the system are intimately correlated and confirm the difference between the 1807 and the Encyclopedia's phenomenology. As a propedeutic, the Jena phenomenology can only be in an ambiguous position toward the system. It is both external and yet necessarily attached to it. On the contrary, as a step in the development of the subjective spirit from the immediate unity of spirit with nature through the relation between body and soul, which is the anthropology, toward the realization of it as a self-knowing spirit, the Encyclopedia's phenomenology remains entirely within Hegel's system. As such, the difference of function and place in the general economy of the system is pretty straightforward. In regards to the difference of content, however, this situation is more delicate. Indeed, in the many attempts to establish his own system of philosophy in the Jena period, Hegel seems to have considered for a time, at least, beginning with a proper philosophical theory of consciousness. And of course, by the time of the Encyclopedia, such a solution was turned down as inadequate. But for a time at least, Hegel cherished the idea of beginning with the system of science through a theory of consciousness, and the Jena phenomenology can be seen as an effort in this sense. Element of this theory will, of course, be integrated into the Encyclopedia's phenomenology. Thus, there are blatant similarities of content in both phenomenology, especially in the consciousness and self-consciousness sections. I would nevertheless argue that there are differences, which a careful analysis of both texts could highlight, but I would also argue that despite the similarities of content and treatment, the general context and goals assigned to both phenomenology will irremediably modify the way both content will be treated. To make my argument plain, I will briefly present what I take to be the function of the phenomenology in the general argument of Hegel's Encyclopedia. The philosophy of subjective spirit begins in the anthropology with the immediate unity of nature and spirit as it presents itself in the human organism through the dialectic between body and soul. Throughout the anthropology, spirit as soul will assert itself by overcoming its immediate and natural idleness. I quote, the soul shows the untruth and unreality of matter, for the soul in its concentrated self cuts itself off from its immediate being, placing the latter over against it as a corporeity incapable of offering resistance to its molding influence. End of quote. So, having conquered nature within, so to speak, spirit become for the first time a proper self, an embodied individual, which now defines itself in relation and in opposition throughout a world that is external to it. As such, whereas the yin of phenomenology start with natural consciousness, which has the immediate certainty of both itself as a self and of the world in itself, this is in the Encyclopedia, on the contrary, the result of a long struggle, which in a sense presupposes all previous development. Accordingly, the fact that consciousness of the world and of its various objects is first apprehended in a somewhat passive and theoretical manner, at first through intuition, then perception, and then understanding, and then in a more practical fashion, as consciousness realizes that the object thus apprehended are merely representations and precisely its own representation, which is how Hegel explains the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness. Which then opens the issue of the practical relation self-consciousness entertains with the world, first as an object of desire that is to be consummated, and then as an object of work, which is in part preserved through its transformation, and so on. All these steps in the development of subjective spirit are meant to show the necessary transition from anthropology as the mere dominion of spirit over its own natural body to the self-knowledge of spirit as a willful subject, because the concept of will is indeed the necessary presupposition of a moral and legal subject, which opens the way to objective spirit. Thus, in the Encyclopedia, the phenomenology allows for a greater determination and a deeper understanding of the cognitive processes of subjective spirit, opening the way from what come next. It is an additive process that we find throughout Hegel's system, where any given moment allows the emergence of a new and more concrete determination that is in turn superseded by another one, and so on. For the yin phenomenology, it is in a sense the opposite. All further determination of what consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit are seen as means of subtraction. They divert natural consciousness from its own illusion and bias. Natural consciousness comes to understand the real underlying foundation of its yet ungrounded certainties. It becomes deprived of its previous illusion. As such, it is a process of deconstruction, which is also, incidentally, of course, a process of reconstruction. But the goal is not here, as it is in the Encyclopedia, of securing one stone in the general construction of philosophical knowledge to allow for the next stone to be adequately secured in position. It would rather be to unlearn what one claims to know in order to ground the foundation of philosophy without erring. Accordingly, even if the content of both phenomenology, especially in the case of consciousness and self-consciousness sections, may be very close, albeit the style may be very different, they nevertheless serve different purpose, which has a certain effect on the content itself. And moreover, this proximity of content soon falls apart if we consider the reason and spirit section in the 1807 Phenomenology, which have no counterpart in the Encyclopedia per se. So as I conclude, I would like to say that, of course, this is all too preliminary, so my argument would have to be sustained by more careful comparative reading of both phenomenology. Nevertheless, I wanted to show that in order to do so, one first need to avoid an easy missteps, which consist of reading one phenomenology into the other and vice versa. And this preliminary work is thus necessary to ensure the feasibility of a project, that is, a comparative reading of both phenomenology, a project which is not only rich, but I think necessary in order to understand how both the 1807 Phenomenology and the Encyclopedia of Phenomenology may consistently stand in relation to the final system as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chaput. Thank you for your presentation. Our third presenter, Federico Orsini, is a professor at the Federal University of Lavras. He will present us a paper on the problem of circularity between the phenomenology of spirit and the science of logic. You have our attention, Professor Orsini.
Thank you, Fabiana. Are you hearing me well?
We do.
Okay. First of all, let me thank you, all the organizer for the great job in putting up this event. And naturally, it would have been great to meet us in São Paulo, but under the present circumstances, we are lucky enough to be able to meet in the internet. So Now let me move on to the presentation of my topic, which is the problem of circularity between the phenomenology of spirit and the science of logic. A long debated issue about Hegel's conception of philosophy is the possible vicious circularity between the phenomenology of spirit of 1807 and the science of logic. On the one hand, some passages from the phenomenology suggest that the scientific character of the work is grounded on the logic, on pure speculative philosophy. On the other hand, some passages from the science of logic, especially from the first preface and the general introduction, claim that speculative philosophy relies on the phenomenology as its presupposition. So the skeptical trope of vicious circularity seems to threaten Hegel's philosophical project of complete critical self-grounding. And the aim of my talk is to diffuse this threat by converting the alleged vicious circularity into a virtuous circularity. And this reorientation of the question of circularity requires a clarification of the distinct senses in which the phenomenology must be understood as the presupposition of the logic and vice versa, without the implication of a logical fallacy. In order to explain the relation at issue, I will adopt a theoretical approach that will include the discussion of some options available in the literature. And because of time limitation, I will totally abstract from a historical approach, which is characterized by its own distinctive issues. The goal of my contribution is to defend the compatibility between two seemingly opposite claims. Claim one, the science of logic presupposes the phenomenology of spirits. Claim two, the science of logic enjoys an absolute presuppositionlessness understood as the accomplishment of pure thinking itself as its object. My argument is articulated in three stages. First place, I will provide a neutralization of the objection of vicious circularity. Second stage, I will briefly examine a couple of relevant positions in the latest Hegel portion about the issue of a possibly reciprocal presupposition between the phenomenology of spirits and the logic. In the third place, I will develop a defense of a virtuous circularity by showing its inner relation to a dynamic conception of systematicity. So first part, diffusing the petitio principii. The reason why the relation of the phenomenology to the logic is not a fallacy is quickly said. The skeptical trope of diallel or petitio principii applies to terms that are supposed to stand in a grounding relation, one being the ground of the other and the other way around. However, neither the phenomenology grounds the science of logic nor the other way around. It would be better to say that the phenomenology of spirit grounds the access to the standpoint of the science of logic, to whom is firmly convinced to ground knowledge on the opposite standpoint, namely the opposition between subject and object, thinking and being. In order to shake this conviction, the phenomenology of spirit uses the trope, skeptical trope of the latter, and undertakes an exercise of, quoting Hegel, self-consummating skepticism, which ends with the immunization of the standpoint of science, of speculative science, against the Pyrrhonian trope of equipolence, which is the claim of the equal validity between the standpoint of finite knowledge, of consciousness, and the standpoint of absolute knowledge. And the key for the dissolution of vicious circularity is, in my view, the distinction between the concept of presupposition, Voraussetzung, and that of ground, rung. And the phenomenology of spirit does not produce a transition to the standpoint of the logic as a ground produces the grounded, but rather in the sense of refuting and demolishing the grounds or reasons that impede the entrance to science. So what the science of logic presupposes is the process of clearing the ground for its own standpoint. And this process is a negation of the basic presupposition that seems to stand against speculation as presuppositionless thinking. So the phenomenology of spirit is a very peculiar genetic presupposition of the logic, because it is an investigation of the coming to be. This is the genesis of the standpoint of science, by way of a demonstration of how the genetic presuppositions of absolute knowing must be brought to the fore or explicated or posited as the moments of its own constitution, of science constitution. And since Hegel admits that the phenomenological investigation is itself a science, this opens the paradox of a science before the science, and thus the issue of circularity between two sciences. Second part, Horstmann and Baumann on the issue of reciprocity or circularity. Two important essays have reanimated the problem from both a historical and a theoretical point of view. Now I will briefly mention Horstmann's and Baumann's positions. Horstmann's essay of 2014 argues that the phenomenology of spirit does not presuppose the sense of logic, whereas the sense of logic presupposes the phenomenology, which must prove the element of pure knowing, the element on which the, I quote, Horstmann metaphysical credo, end of quotation, of Hegel's system is grounded. And according to Horstmann, the only way to dissolve the impression of a vicious circle consists in avoiding the confusion between the standpoint of science and the standpoint of the logic in a strict sense, namely logic as the first science of the system. In his essay, Brady Baumann, in an essay of 2018, raises some criticisms against Horstmann's position, especially against his distinction between the standpoint of science and the standpoint of the logic, and proposes the following solution. The circularity between the phenomenology and the logic can be neutralized once we acknowledge that the presupposition of the phenomenology is meant to make explicit, which is the possibility of making claims to the knowledge of truth on the part of consciousness, does not belong to the logical science. Because the logical science aims to prove, here I quote Baumann, I quote and I translate Baumann, the identity of the idea with being, not the identity between the idea and the decision of the will to think purely, end of quotation. However, the sense of logic provides the ultimate ground of the togetherness, Zusammengehörigkeit, togetherness of certainty and truth for all truth claims. Accordingly, Baumann's solution is the converse of Horstmann's solution, because Baumann claims that the phenomenology of spirit presupposes the logic, because the sense of the phenomenological enterprise, I quote again Baumann, can be disclosed only from the perspective of the resolve to will to think purely. So without having already taken the standpoint of science, it is not even possible to find out the problem to which the phenomenology ought to answer. End of quote. Third part, in defense of a virtuous circularity. Horstmann's and Baumann's arguments both dispel in different ways the vicious circularity between the phenomenology and the logic. However, as far as I understand them, they leave aside the possibility and even the necessity of entertaining a different conception of circularity. In my view, we should pursue a virtuous kind of circularity between the phenomenology and the logic. And a virtuous circularity means a dynamic or self-constituting circularity expressing the truth, or better, the togetherness of certainty, namely immediate self-knowing and truth, which is the identity of knowing and being, as a process of self-constitution actualized in the object and in the subject of knowing without any subjective imposition or external presupposition. So in the last part, I will try to explain this claim through a series of steps which are connected by the following guideline, the following argument, which is, if circularity is the form of achievement of systematicity, and if systematicity is the only guarantee of science, and if the logical and the phenomenological science are both necessary for the self-grounding of the system, then the relation between the two must be systematic and thus inherently circular. At the same time, if the circle is not a state, but an internally teleological movement, then it cannot be a coming and going from one term to another, so a vicious circularity. Instead, it must involve a transition towards the science of pure form, which is the logic. So pure knowing, logic, and appearing knowing, phenomenology, are not symmetrical. Let me now examine some aspects and steps of these arguments. First step, the problem of the phenomenology is neither a psychological problem nor a merely historical problem, but rather a philosophical one. Namely, how to legitimate the necessity of the standpoint of science, of speculative science. Second step, although Hegel passes from a bipartite to a tripartite conception of the system and revises the position of Jena's phenomenology with respect to the system after 1807, he never denies the permanent value of the problem of the phenomenology of spirit and its ability to overcome insufficient or limited conceptions of knowing and truth. And the permanent value of the phenomenology of spirit that after 1807 was stressed by scholars like Kervégan and Kervégan. For this reason, both the first preface of the Science of Logic and the introduction to the second edition of the Doctrine of Being confirm the role of the Jena's phenomenology as a deduction of the concept of science. Third step, phenomenology and logic are unified by an internal community between speculative and appearing knowing. And this common bond is the structure of knowing, which implies the idea of the subjectivity of the process of truth, according to the well-known programmatic claim of the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is a preface to the whole of the system. But the structure of knowing, which I'm talking about, is not a fixed structure. It's a dialectical, which means self-correcting and self-transforming. As a result of its experience, the structure of consciousness turns out to be the appearance of the structure of spirit, so that the finite subjectivity finally discovers that its path of despair is driven by a goal, namely the satisfying comprehension of its relation to the actual world. And so it can be recollected, erinnert, as a way towards infinite subjectivity or absolute knowing. So the end of the phenomenology is simultaneously a return to its beginning, namely to the conceptual determination of the object of sensible certainty, and the opening of a new beginning, namely the beginning of pure knowing as the medium or the element of the knowability of any possible being. Fourth step, as distinct places of the system, the phenomenology of spirit and the logic have not also something in common, namely the dynamic of spirit and thereby the purpose of establishing a new concept of science, but also important differences concerning their content and method. Once Hegel changed his plan from the idea of making of the phenomenology of spirit the first part of the system to the idea of a tripartite system built around the three main forms of the idea, so the encyclopedic project, the science of logic came to be the first part, or science of the system, as the exposition of the idea in the element of pure thinking. And this element is clearly distinct from natural or impure consciousness, which was, at least initially, the element of the phenomenology of spirit. However, both elements, so pure knowing and appearing knowing, are modes of being of spirit. And spirit is a double movement of externalization and interiorization. And the Erinnerung is expressed, in my view, in the phenomenology by the action through which absolute knowing looks back at its path and knows itself as what was implicitly involved in the sensible certainty as the most immediate figure of knowing. And in the logic, this spirit's interiorization is the action to which the absolute idea recollects the beginning of science and knows itself as the inner goal of pure being, as the most immediate identity of pure thinking and being. Fifth and the last step, among the totality of the circles of the system, the phenomenology of spirit and the logic not only are independently of one another circles or spheres of determination, each in respect of its own element, but they also form one circle of reciprocal presupposition. However, they do not fall prey to a circle of foundation, petitio principii, because they presuppose each other according to distinct senses of presupposition, and not according to a grounding relation, and according to reason's purposive activity, which strives towards a theory of satisfying self-comprehension. On the one side, so I want to now highlight these two distinct senses of presupposition. On the one side, the sense of logic presupposes the phenomenology in the sense that the decision to philosophize is possible only when the forms of one-sidedness that prevent subjective consciousness from willing to think are overcome. In other words, the science of logic presupposes the result of the phenomenology, namely the concept of science, but neither the specific elements of this science nor its specific method, which is the phenomenological experience of the limitation of some standards of knowledge from the first-person perspective and the complication of a discrepancy between what is for consciousness and what holds for us, for speculative philosophers. At the same time, the result of the phenomenology must be established also within the logic, where the subject of knowledge is no more defined by a journey from consciousness to spirit, but rather by spirit knowing the conceptual nature of the logic of cognition as such, not just cognition on the part of consciousness. On the other side, it is the case that the phenomenology presupposes the element of the science of logic, namely the conceptual nature of the object of knowledge. Although these elements, these conceptual elements, cannot be transparent because of the proper method of the phenomenology, which is characterized by the intertwinement of two levels of analysis, marked by the expressions for consciousness and for us, or in itself. And this second level, the level for us or in itself, makes explicit the necessity that guides the scientific reconstruction of the transitions from one shape of consciousness to another, and describes the logic that is displayed, so to speak, behind the back of consciousness itself. Accordingly, the phenomenology presupposes both the standpoint of science as a goal that motivates the project of Phenomenology of Spirit, namely how to get to science from the standpoint of consciousness, of non-science. And the phenomenology presupposes the logic under the aspect of a certain correspondence between some logical determination of the object of consciousness, for example, being, property, essence, force, etc., and some determinate claim of knowledge or consciousness holding for true. So my conclusion is that we can say that the circularity between the phenomenology and the science of logic is virtuous insofar as it is ruled by the logic of positing its own presupposition, explored in some of the most difficult pages of the doctrine of essence in the science of logic, and then in the logic of the concept self-explication studied in the doctrine of the concept. And the presupposition at issue, which is a rational, not an arbitrary, ungrounded presupposition. The presupposition that must be posited or explicated is the old rationalist conviction that thinking is objective and thus can, by its own, realize the co-constituting connection between certainty and truth. In the act of positing, which is in fact not some singular act of some individual creative philosopher, but the sustained effort of a collectively achieved modern project of self-understanding, the act of positing does not leave the presupposition as it is, but dissolves precisely the presupposition as a form, namely the form of belief or immediate knowing, because the act of positing transforms any first immediacy into the one-sided moment of a self-determining reflexive activity without external or internal undeveloped presuppositions. So once we understand the reason of the transition from the phenomenology to the logic, the identity of thoughts and being stops seeming a magic or some special presupposition we should endorse, or as a matter of faith, as Horstmann seems to have it when he speaks about a metaphysical credo. Instead, it turns out to be the first part of the journey through which Absolute Spirit comprehends that it is the, I quote from the logic, concrete and ultimate supreme truth of all being. So the Absolute Spirit comprehends the true value of the logic, no more as first science, but as last science. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. The fourth paper will be presented by Rob Dunphy, a postdoctoral researcher at University College Dublin. The title of his paper is The Scientific Status of Hegel's Logic and the Matter of its Beginning. Please, Mr. Dunphy, you may begin your presentation. I think you wish to share your screen with us. If you need any help, Paulo will share your material for you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
And
Perfect.
can you see my screen as well?
Yes, we can.
Super. Okay, I'll dash straight on in then because I know we're short on time. Thanks very much for having me and for organising this great event. So here's my title. It's me. This is the sort of prompt. This presentation is prompted by this passage, which is from sort of the second half of Hegel's essay, "With what must the beginning of the science be made," which is at the opening of his Science of Logic. And it reads, "The essential thing for the science of logic is not so much that the beginning be a pure immediacy, but rather that the whole science is a circle in which the first becomes the last and the last also the first." And I think sometimes people read passages like this one of Hegel's and think that what's important about the circular structure of the logic is that it's playing some sort of role in justifying the beginning of the logic and justifying beginning with the concept of pure being or this pure immediacy. And I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong, for one thing, by the time Hegel writes this passage in that essay, he's already made a case for beginning the logic with the concept of pure being, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And secondly, that's not what the passage, if you look at the passage, it's not what it says, right? It doesn't say that what's essential for the beginning of the logic is that the science is a circle, but what is essential for the science of logic as a whole is not so much that it begins with pure being, but that it's circular. And so what I wanted to sort of talk about was the criteria that Hegel observes in attempting a scientific treatment of logic, where first and foremost that means attempting a scientific treatment of the basic categories of thought, right? So here's a sort of a sketch of what this whole presentation sort of would be about. I'm going to move quickly through some bits of it, and I'm going to skip another bit of it just because of the time pressure, but it might be helpful for context. So what I'm going to talk about is, very briefly, I'm going to talk about some criteria for what constitutes a scientific treatment of logic that I think Hegel just inherits from the rationalist tradition. Then I was going to talk briefly about why it's important, which the more sort of idiosyncratically Hegelian criterion for a science, that it be circular, but I'm actually going to skip that, right? Because for time reasons. Well, I'll just say that whatever it's about, it's not about guaranteeing or securing beginning with pure being. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why it is important that science of logic begins with the concept of pure being. And what I want to do there, if I can get there, is suggest that in the two sort of different presentations of the beginning of the logic that Hegel gives, in the big science of logic, it looks as though he has one particular argument for why it ought to begin with the concept of pure being. But in the Encyclopedia logic, it looks as though he kind of backs away from that argument a little bit. And that bothers me, so I want to see what you think about it. So just briefly, some sort of criteria for a science of logic. Hegel says repeatedly, but here's just some examples, that a scientific logic or scientific treatment of logic must be a demonstration of the necessity of its content, or a systematic derivation, eine systematische Ableitung, or a proof, a beweis of its results, right? And that's pretty standard, right, for rationalist treatments of logical metaphysics. I'm not going to talk about the relationship between logic and metaphysics for Hegel now, right? But the kind of classical, I suppose the classic example is Spinoza's ethics, right? And Hegel, which presents a sort of systematic science according to a kind of geometrical presentation, in which each step is demonstrated by the previous steps. And I think Hegel wants to say exactly the same thing about his treatment of logic. I know that he And he does in the preface to the second edition of Logic say that the steps between the derivation of one concept from the next concept should be like mathematical inferences. I know that he also has criticisms about the geometrical style of earlier rationalists, but I take it that what he doesn't, I'm not going to talk about it, but I take it what he's objecting to there is not the idea that it should be a demonstrative science. I think he clearly thinks that is crucial, right? And here's Kant talking about, next quote on there, is Kant talking about this idea of a demonstrative science, right? And this is in the context of him saying in the Critique of Pure Reason that he wants to avoid dogmatism, but not the dogmatic procedure, which is what he calls this idea, right? And he says, science must always be dogmatic. That is, it must prove its conclusions strictly a priori from secure principles. So there's two, so I've said already that it's meant to be a demonstrative science. There's two other things here in Kant's passage that I think Hegel also agrees with, right? Neither of them is uncontroversial. You'll be able to find people who disagree with me about this, but I'm willing to change my mind about maybe the second one more than the first, but we'll see, right? The first one is that logic should be an a priori science, right? The next passage here, Hegel says, right, that the subject matter of logic is a set of fundamental concepts or categories or determinations of thought. And he says that this kind of concept, quote, is not sensibly intuited or represented, vorgestellt, right? It is only the object, product, and content of thought. Well, I just want to say, if it's not sensibly intuited and represented, if it's only the product of thought, then it's a priori, right? The subject matter and the procedure is an a priori one. You can disagree with me, and I know there are passages that might make that rather might cause difficulties for that, but that's what I think. And the second thing is this. The second criterion is this thing about secure principles. And I think Hegel actually goes a step further here. I think, again, this is not uncontroversial, that Hegel is one of those people who thinks that scientific systematic philosophy should be grounded on a single fundamental principle, like Reinhold does, like Fichte does, like I think Schelling does, for at least for a while, right? I think Hegel, there's evidence that Hegel thinks that, because he says that the account of the categories of thought that he provides in logic ultimately grounded in the concept, right, which functions as, quote, absolute foundation to the science of logic, right, as another quote, the foundation of the determinate concepts that he examines in the logic, right? So the various concepts that he derives, from one another and examines and sets out, explicates in his science of logic are grounded in the structure of the concept, as he says, moments in the form of a totality. And when he talks about the concept as the foundation of logic, he explicitly compares it to Spinoza's substance. I know he's also partly to distinguish it from that, but I think it's playing a similar role for him, right? So I think there's something like a fundamental principle, and I think it should be grounded in a fundamental principle and an a priori science. And I think both of those are the case for Hegel, right? Regarding this idea of a fundamental principle, the problem with the sort of obvious problem with approaches like that is expressed pretty clearly here by Fichte, when he says that the primordial, absolutely unconditioned first principle can neither be proved nor defined. All right, and that seems like it's a skeptical problem for any attempt to develop a systematic scientific philosophy on the basis of a single first principle, right? Because you can't prove the first principle because it's supposed to be the first principle. It's supposed to be the beginning. What are you relying on in order to prove it? In what sense is it still a first principle? But you can't just define it if that means just assert it. Just assume it. This is the beginning, because why should anybody agree with you that that's a valid, absolutely unconditioned first principle, right? The difference that Hegel, it's not. You could say that later on Reinhold does something a bit similar, but the difference for Hegel is that he doesn't begin with what in his science of logic is playing the role of a fundamental principle. Right? I mean, he doesn't begin with the account of the concept, which is the absolute foundation of the determinate concepts, right? the progression of the logic is, he says, quote, retreat into its ground, end quote, right? Instead, famously, logic begins with this concept of pure being, right, which is not really a very interesting concept. Certainly not any kind of absolute unconditioned first principle, right? So Hegel, in the face of that problem from Fichte for absolutely unconditioned first principles, I think Hegel's answer is, no, we can prove it. I can prove it. I can prove the validity, the necessity of the concept as a fundamental principle because I derive it, right? Now, that leaves all sorts of questions unanswered. One very obvious one, which I'm going to talk about, is, okay, fine, but why is it valid to begin with pure being, right? Can you prove or derive or make an argument for beginning with pure being? Because if it's the beginning, then that seems rather suspect. Or are you just assuming or just arbitrarily saying we're beginning with pure being? Because both of those look slightly problematic, even if you're not claiming that it's the first principle, right? So what I would do now is pause and talk a little bit about circularity of logic, but I'm going to skip that and just talk about the beginning, right? So I've said, right, Hegel's committed to the idea that, to these claims. A, properly scientific treatment of logic must proceed by way of strict derivation concept to concept, right? And B, that this derivation begins from the account of the concept of pure being, even though it proceeds as a retreat into its ground and it ultimately secures the results of the science in the concept, right? So in the face of those two claims, it seems reasonable, as I've just suggested, that for a skeptical interlocutor to say, why should we accept that it's legitimate to begin with pure being, right? And it looks as though you would expect Hegel to take that kind of, at least the mature Hegel, right, to take that kind of concern seriously, right? Here he is in the Phenomenology of Spirit saying one bare assurance is exactly as valid as another. So if I'm just assuring you that it's legitimate to begin with pure being, it's just as valid for you to say no, begin somewhere else, right? And in the Encyclopedia logic, he acknowledges, right, it's clearly unsatisfactory to begin merely with presuppositions or assurances. So I will just say very, very briefly as an aside, I think I have time, that Hegel making these kinds of claims, which look like he's aware that it's not legitimate to just assert the beginning of a scientific project, he doesn't seem to be making those kinds of claims any earlier than the composition of the Phenomenology of Spirit, right? In his earlier publications at Jena and in his review of Schulz's Kritik der theoretischen Philosophie is a perfect example of this, because it's where he talks a lot about skepticism and speculative philosophy. He seems quite content to say about, in the face of skeptical worries about scientific philosophy, well, because skepticism typically operates by way of opposing equally plausible alternatives and getting you to suspend judgment, and because I'm operating with a notion of speculative reason that encompasses conceptual oppositions, skepticism just isn't a problem for me. So it's completely useless against speculative reason. And the obvious problem with that response to the skeptic is, well, why on earth should the skeptic accept the validity of this notion of speculative reason that you're claiming encompasses oppositions in a way that means that it negates skeptical threats, right? And by the time Hegel writes the Phenomenology, and certainly by the time he writes the Logic, it looks as though he's obviously shifted his perspective there. And we've actually heard a bit about that already. It looks as though he thinks, by that point, no, you need to justify what you're doing to a skeptical opponent, right? That's what one of the things that the Phenomenology is supposed to be doing. So let's just very briefly talk about the beginning of the two versions of the beginning of the Logic, right? Here he is at the beginning of that essay with what must the beginning of the science be made. And he says there, the beginning of philosophy must be either something mediated or something immediate. And it's easy to show that it can be neither one nor the other, so that either way of beginning finds its rebuttal. And that passage is obviously meant to recall Fichte's problem for first principles that I quoted earlier, right? The difference being that for Hegel, the problem of beginning and the problem of first principles are separate problems, but the structure of the problem is the same. So here's Hegel saying, well, if I begin with something mediated, I've derived it from somewhere, I've arrived at it on the basis of something else, and the justification for that seems immediately suspect. But if I just begin with something immediate, if I just assert, we're beginning here, that also seems suspect. So there's the problem. And I'm not going to throw loads of quotes with what must the beginning of science be made. I'm just going to paraphrase the argument that Hegel gives in six steps. And I'm not going to evaluate it and say whether it's a good argument or a bad argument, but this is how I think that argument goes, okay? 1, he thinks that problem, we've just seen, this problem, either something immediated or something immediate, depends on the assumption that the word or must be understood exclusively, right? So you begin either only with something mediated or only with something immediate, right? And then he says, we don't need that assumption, right? So it might be that there's a concept or a thought content that is both mediated and immediate. In fact, he's going to say that about a lot of stuff, right? And then he's going to argue that the concept of pure being, I think, can be understood to be both mediated and immediate, right? It's mediated because it is arrived at on the basis of a thoroughgoing examination or critique of the insufficiencies or incoherences of everyday or dogmatic conceptions of thought, right? Of the kind he's carried out in his Phenomenology of Spirit. The previous speaker gave a lovely account of that, right? Of the sense in which the phenomenology is a clearing of the ground for the logic, right? And so the argument of the phenomenology justifies the abandonment of the conceptions of ordinary consciousness and results in a thought that's purged of any and all of those contents, right? And that mediated result, Hegel says, is pure being, right? It's just thought once all of the presuppositions and assumptions and content of ordinary consciousness have been abandoned, criticized and abandoned, or eliminated. But, he argues, this empty thinking, as he calls it, is so radically simple that it exhibits no relation to the mediation from which it derives, right? So the concept of pure being is just an indeterminate immediacy, right? So this is the context famously that he says, that, the concept of the beginning of the logic presupposes the argument of the phenomenology, but it's also presuppositionless, right? This is the same as saying it's mediated and it's immediate, okay? And understood this way, the concept of pure being as the unity of mediation and immediacy, I think Hegel is saying it's open neither to the skeptical claim that it's just been assumed, because it hasn't been just assumed, it's been derived from the argument of the phenomenology. It also doesn't exhibit a problematic dependence on some prior derivation, some mediation, right? So it has an anti-skeptical security that other candidates for the beginning of logic lack, right? And that's why logic ought to begin with pure being. That's, I think, Hegel's argument. Now, just to conclude, I want to say that it seems to me that at the beginning of the Encyclopedia logic is different, and it's different in a way that bothers me, right? So I won't give you quite as much detail. I'll just tell you the sort of the differences, right? So the Encyclopedia logic begins in the same way, right? The difficulty with legitimizing the beginning springs from the fact that it looks as though such a beginning for logic either is going to rest on unproven presuppositions, which is suspect, or because it's immediate, it is itself just a presupposition, or is just itself an assumption. So it's the same problem, right? And then he says this opposition of immediacy and mediation, which is incompatible with the immediacy, should be set aside because it's just an assumption. It's itself just an assumption. So it's the same point, right? Let's not assume that mediation and immediacy are exclusive determinations, right? And so it looks as though the argument's going to be exactly the same. We should think about the concept of pure being as mediated and immediate. Difference one, in the Encyclopedia logic, instead of phenomenology, instead of his 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel describes the mediation, the derivation behind beginning with pure being, as a negative science of accomplished skepticism. Maybe that is a reference to the argument of the Phenomenology, because this phrase vollbrachte Skeptizismus sounds an awful lot like the sich vollbringende Skeptizismus from the Phenomenology. But I'm not sure that I kind of don't think that he is talking about the Phenomenology there. Maybe we can talk about more about that, because I need to finish. Second difference, the important difference, although Hegel again insists on the immediacy of the beginning, right? That it's presuppositionless, that it's simple. He does, in the Encyclopedia, it looks as though he's gone off the idea that it's important to show that the concept of pure being isn't just an assumption by deriving it, right? So instead of insisting on deriving the concept of pure being by means either of Phenomenology of Spirit or of some negative science of skepticism, some skeptical argument, right? He says it would be not only an unpleasant, but also a superfluous path to do that. And instead, just the resolution to think purely and freely abstract from all assumptions or content is sufficient to begin logic with the concept of pure being. Now, he actually says more about that, but I've run out of time. All I want to say is, I think that this, it seems to me that what he's saying in the Encyclopedia risks slipping back into the kind of position that he was in, he exhibited in his earlier works, where he seems to just sort of assume that the beginning of the project is a legitimate one, without properly justifying it. And I think that's a problem with his Encyclopedia presentation of the beginning of logic. But I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dunphy. Thank you for sharing your PowerPoint presentation. I call our last presenter, Martina Barnaba, a doctoral student at La Sapienza University of Rome. The title of her paper is Essence and Representation as Moments of Mediation in the Hegelian System, a comparison between the logic and the psychology of the subjective spirit. You have our attention, Ms. Barnaba.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity of being here today. So thank you very much, and I will begin right away. So today I would like to establish a comparison between the Hegelian logic and another part of the Hegelian system, that is the psychology of the subjective spirit. And in doing so, I hope I will be able to show how the logic is the basic structure of reality. So how the logic, as we know, is the living soul of Hegel's ontology. I will therefore show a correspondence between being, essence, and notion on one side, and intuition, representation, and thought on the other. And I will focus mainly on the second moments of these two dialectics, so essence and representation, in order to demonstrate the importance of mediation. So in the end, I will also briefly remind how mediation is necessary to the functioning of the dialectic, but also to the circularity of Hegel's system. I will start with the logic, and I would like first and foremost to explain the passage from being to essence, because I believe that in this passage we can already recognize the characteristics, I call them connotations in my paper, that are proper to the movement of the essence, but that I will also retrace in the representation. So at the beginning of the section on the essence, Hegel writes that the truth of being is essence. And a bit further, he adds that only in as much as knowledge recollects itself into itself out of immediate being, does it find essence through this mediation. So he's stating, in other words, that the immediacy of the passing over, the famous Übergehen of the sphere of being, has been finally mediated, and that means that the movement is no longer a transition from a determination to another, but an internalizing of that same determination in itself. So the first connotation that I'm going to assign to essence, the first element that characterizes it, in my opinion, is Erinnerung, so its character of Erinnerung, because in essence being goes back to its internal core, and it stops, as I was saying, to pass from A to B in an external way. It finally finds itself in itself. And we could also say that essence is the self-conscience of the thing, because it is characterized by that movement, that immanent movement that is typical of self-consciousness, the self-conscious kind of status that we know as reflection. So this is my second connotation, reflection. While the Übergehen was being's operation, the reflection belongs to essence as its principal functioning. Hegel explains at the end of the chapter on the Schein what reflection means, and it treats it as a category that somehow encompasses the entirety of the logic of the essence. He writes that essence is reflection, the movement of becoming and transition that remains within itself. So what is actually reflection? It is basically that immanent movement of self-negating and self-referring that makes essence a relation of itself within itself, and not at a transition into the opposite, as Hegel writes. So this is why I would say that essence displays already what will be the concrete mediation of the notion. So essence has already that being in and for itself that characterizes the dialectic of the concept. And it reveals, in a way, the secret of immediate being. But in doing so, it poses itself against itself, as we were saying, and it generates a duality. All of its categories contain couples of determinations, as we know. And this duality is the space in which we could say that things go somehow astray. Because these determinations, the determinations of reflection that we find in the logic of the essence, appear at the same time as excluding each other. So the self-reference that they obtain by mediating and reflecting themselves in the others assume a kind of self-subsistence that opposes them as independent and diverse, Hegel will say. And this is also what Hegel calls external reflection. So it is the comparison operated by a third from an externality that keeps the determinations of the duality separated and not in relation to each other anymore. And it is also the relapse into the logic of being, because the external character that we assign to the movement of the Übergehen is to a certain extent here at hand again. And I find this particularly interesting because external reflection, in a way, creates an instability in its searching for stability. So in its trying to keep the determination separated, and it's trying to maintain an order, I would say, in saying that A is A and not B, and B is B and not A, external reflection is actually relating these determinations once more. It is relating them again. So it is falling back into an immanent reflection, and it contradicts itself, basically. So this is why essence is, in a way, the realm of instability, but also the realm of division and conflict, because of this constant back and forth between these two kinds of reflection. And this duality, this conflicting duality that characterizes essence, will only find resolution in the notion. So when the notion will arise, the entire development of the essence, as we know, is a struggle between internal essence and what Hegel calls Erscheinung, that will find resolution, as I was saying, in actuality. So when the notion will be able, with its thinking, with its speculative thinking, will be able to keep the contradiction of external and internal reflection together, so holding this contradiction. And Jean Hippolyte uses an expression that I find very interesting and intelligent. He says that essence, because of this duality, this conflicting nature, is ontologist and epiconsciousness. So he borrows a figure from the Phenomenology. But this entire treatment that I'm trying to present leads us also to another characteristic, to another connotation, because essence appears as a median area, so as a middle ground, a mediation between being and notion. So it possesses implicitly that conceptual soul of the logic of the notion that we were talking about before, and at the same time, it is still tempted by the exteriority and separation of the logic of being. I would like now to give you a concrete example very quickly, because we're short on time, I know. And let's take, for example, the essentialities of reflection, so identity and difference. We can recognize in this section the characteristics that I was talking about, that I just gave you. So first of all, identity presents itself as a movement of interiorization that we defined as Erinnerung. Hegel says that essence is simple self-identity, meaning that identity is not related to another, but to itself inside itself. And in this relation, we find also the famous reflection, because identity is a duplication of itself in which there is self-negativity, so it contains the other from itself in order to be itself. And this is more or less the secret of Hegelian dialectic, we could say. Identity is identity because it contains difference from difference, and difference as well is difference because it is identical to itself. So we have here two determinacies that are immanently self-related. They are into each other, literally, but at the same time, they also fall apart. So identity that is identity through difference and difference that is difference through identity become two separate wholes. They are diverse, Hegel will say. So we jump into diversity. Here we can recognize external reflection, how it works. And diversity as well will relate likeness and unlikeness to another once more, and the instability will show itself here because we will have a new form of difference, and so on and so on. It will keep presenting itself as this way until, as I was saying, the essence will find its resolution in the notion, so in that speculative way of thinking that can hold the two kinds of reflection together. But I was just giving you an example to show how reflection, Erinnerung, but also this mediation role of essence work. And I will now retrace the same characteristics in the psychology, so we can skip to the Encyclopedia, where, as I was saying at the beginning, I want to show how intuition, representation, and thought correspond in a way to being, essence, and notion. I'll read the first lines of the chapter on representation, in which Hegel says that representation is the recollected intuition, and as such is the mean between intelligence immediate finding itself determined and intelligence in its freedom, thinking. The representation is intelligence's own possession, still with one-sided subjectivity, since this possession is not self-contained being, but still conditioned by immediacy. So starting from the last connotation that I assigned to essence, this median role between being and notion, we can observe here how representation is as well a middle ground, so a mediation between intuition and thought, what Hegel calls immediate intelligence and free intelligence. And Hegel also explains this by defining representation as the link between the particularity of the intuitive material and the universality of thought. So something that elevates the first to the second, but is still somehow latched to this first particular intuitive material. Representation internalizes intuition in that same modality that Hegel calls Erinnerung. So we have the Erinnerung here as well, because the immediacy of the sphere of intuition, where the material that is perceived by senses and feelings through space and time remains external, corresponds to the stage of being, in which the externality of the Übergehen is not yet immanently split into conflicting moments. So interior and exterior are not in explicit opposition. And in representation, on the contrary, just like in essence, we could say, intelligence realizes how the intuitive material is not a mere object outside of itself, but something that is instead inside the subject. So the first stage of representation is literal recollection, Erinnerung, and this means that the outside object of intuition gets abstracted from its spatio-temporal context and subsumed in an internal image. So after having internalized intuition, representation is able to externalize this content again. In doing so, it generates and links together two sides, a bit like the dual categories of the logic, because we have here an internal essence that belongs already to the universality of the thought, and an external appearance, which is both the repositing and the residue of the intuition. In being able to be itself in the other of itself, representation is therefore a moment of reflection. The movement of internal reflection that splits essence in two in order to recognize itself in itself through the other is never completely final, as we saw, because what Hegel calls external reflection makes its appearance and renews the opposition from an outside point of view. Representation too, so this is another comparison that I can make, representation too struggles between this unconciliated division and every attempt at unifying the two standpoints of content and form, significance and expression, particular intuition and concrete universal thought turns up into an external synthesis. So the comparison of the external reflection that constitutes the relapse of the essence in the logic of being presents itself once more in the incapacity of representation of holding the two sides of the difference in a concrete mediated unity. And this incapacity, of course, it derives from the limits of intuition that still corrupt, in a way, representation. These limits are the Nebeneinander und Nacheinander of space and time. And we can say that even if representation and essence already contain the in and for itself of thought and notion, they don't have yet their interpenetrated unity. They will start to reach it only in actuality, in the case of the logic, as we saw, and in memory, in the case of representation, where sign-making, intelligence, and language appear. But before that, the intelligence must go through imagination and symbol-making intelligence, which is the part that I will briefly analyze now in order to give you another example, just like I did with the essentialities of reflections for the logic. So imagination is the faculty that knows how to manipulate and rearrange the internal images of recollection in order to universalize them and later express them through the particularity of intuition. And this is, I find this really interesting because this is what happens in fantasy, the realm of symbolizing, allegorizing, and creative imagination, Hegel says. So we see clearly here how imagination not only works with the Erinnerung, the internal recollection of previously external intuitions, but also how it enacts the movement of reflection by exteriorizing again this internal content with its symbol making and later on sign making fantasy. The symbol is in fact a double structure. It is composed of a content or significant on one side and an expression on the other. This expression is usually a sensible image that has some kind of link to the concept that it carries. And I would say it is also the perfect example, the symbol, it is the perfect example of how representation stands as a median connection between senses and ideas, intuition and thought. Because in the symbol, intelligence manages to abstract from the manifold of the intuitive experience and find a common trait of these various determinations that can be elevated to universality. In saying, for instance, that the strength of Jupiter is symbolized by the eagle, which is of course a strong animal, Hegel shows how the symbol is the root of the metaphor and of the allegoric and poetic processes that belong to art. But in being associated with art, which is known to be the sphere of senses, we can see how the symbol has an inadequacy, the inadequacy at expressing completely the conceptual nature of the universal content. So the symbol has basically still too much to do with intuition, because an image that still involves sensibility, space, and time at some degrees does not correspond truly and entirely to a concept. So this form is not conceptual. The concept needs a form that matches its content. The many times mentioned relapse in the logic of being of external reflection that we traced in the return of the Übergehen at the level of essence is once again present in the separation between content and expression that, as I was saying, although sharing a link, which could be the strength in Jupiter and the eagle, for example, are not completely interpenetrated. And this duality is kept divided by an external comparison that will be overcome only later in the sign, which makes the expression completely transparent to its content, so in language and so on. But, and I will conclude now, we must not forget that these sensible depictions, these images and experience in general, I would say, are fundamental to thought and to its expression, to its concretization. Because ideas and concepts always need the mediation of these second moments that I talked about during this presentation. So as cliché as may sound, the meaning of the Aufhebung is tollere et conservare. I will use this Latin expression to say that the meaning is to criticize and to go back, to recover and restore the sublated determinations. But not only that, the determination that have been sublated show themselves as the necessary moments that ensure that same sublation. So the idea, as well as the concept and the absolute in general, we could say, have to contain the laceration constituted by the splitting of self-negation. Otherwise, they wouldn't be all. They would still linger in the immediacy of the first moment without having developed the process that defines what they are. And the spirit, as we know, is indeed this process. So if we apply this entire treatment, entire Aufhebung situation to the logic and the psychology, we could say that the notion couldn't solve the contradiction and couldn't be itself if no contradiction would arise in the first place. So if essence wouldn't be there with its splitting nature, with its division. And thought as well couldn't find its concrete nature without the duality of form and content of representation. Representation is particular, I believe, because it mediates thought in that it works as a Beispiel, Hegel will say, an example of thought's own structure, so as it could be somehow the flesh of the concept. And this means, of course, that in the passage from representation to thought, the latter must first criticize the sensitive character of representation that we traced in the relapsing to intuition, but then it has to go back to reconsider this sensitive material as an image and a metaphor, perhaps, in which it can fulfill itself. So I will conclude now. I just want to stress out how important these moments of mediation, and in particular in the case of representation and thought, this moment of senses and experience and concrete images are fundamental to the ideas and the rest of the concepts and the logic in general, and so how the circularity works in Hegel's system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Barnaba. Thank you all for contributing with your research to this roundtable. I now invite dear Professor Michela Bordignon to give her remarks on each paper. And I ask the presenters to keep your cameras on. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Professor Hepa, Fabiana, and all the equipe of the organizer for the invitation here. But guys, this is a really difficult task because these papers are really dense, thought-provoking, and thanks, guys, for sharing with me your papers. I have really learned a lot. I've thought a lot of the last days when I read your papers. And I also want to say sorry for my English. I hope it's understandable. My Portuguese, after some years in Brazil, is getting a little bit better, but surely my English is really getting worse. So if something is not clear, just let me know and I will try to be clear. Okay, so I start with Jiahiu paper. I'm sorry, the audio was not so clear so mainly I will base my consideration on the paper I read. I will skip some minor points and I will just mention a couple of remarks. First of all, I really thought that this idea to use the learner paradox to highlight the problematic status of the dialectic of the phenomenology is great. So congratulations for the paper. I thought it was really, really interesting, and the way you put the problem was clearer. And I'm not sure if I got you right. I really, if everything is clear with me, with your way out of the paradox. And the way it highlights the problematic status of the dialectic of the phenomenology. But first of all, I just want to mention a part of your paper. I think it's the central part when you are analyzing the relation between the in itself and the for itself. And you say that the examining consciousness discovers the inconsistencies between the in itself and the for it. It has to adjust, the consciousness had to adjust its knowledge. And this was one little problematic point for me. And why that? Because in the immanent examination of the shapes of consciousness, with the emergence of the inconsistency between the in itself and for itself, I think it's not the consciousness that needs to adjust its knowledge to the object, but it seems that it's the object that transforms itself through the analysis of the content of the experience of consciousness. And I think that this is a detail, but it is also an important point, because there are a lot of interpretations of the phenomenology that tends to read the phenomenology, the phenomenological path as a kind of process of trial and errors. But the dialectic of the phenomenology, as you point out in the central part of the paper, is much more complicated than that. And then I have just I skip other minor points. I have just a general question that addresses, I think, what can be considered the main point of your paper, or one of the main points of your paper, which is the role of the phenomenologist. It is certainly true that the phenomenology needs the phenomenologist. There is no phenomenological path analysis. There is no phenomenological analysis without a phenomenologist that investigates the experiences of consciousness. And it is of course completely true that the phenomenologist is actively involved in the necessary passage from one shape of consciousness to the other. Nevertheless, when you claim, and I quote your paper, both the being in itself and the being for consciousness aspect of consciousness need to be accounted for on the basis of the for us. When you say that, I'm not convinced, I'm not sure I completely agree with you, and I would like to know more about this point, because actually we as phenomenologists, we do this work of explicitation of the internal contents of every shapes of consciousness, but we do that on the basis of these same contents, and not what we think about this content, on how we conceive or interpret these contents. On a general perspective, it seems to me that your reading, the way you use the learner paradox leads you to interpret the relationship between the development of the shapes of consciousness and the role of the phenomenologist in a determinate way. And since the knowledge of consciousness is finite, there needs to be someone, the phenomenologist, who already know what is necessary in order to overcome the limit of each form of consciousness. Someone that we could say can teach the consciousness what is the right path to overcome the limits of each form of consciousness. And ultimately, the phenomenologist must do maybe a work of guidance, of education, or we could say the phenomenology helps the consciousness to remember, to erinner who it is, and then needs to helps the consciousness to remember that it is spirit. In this sense, also the relation between the Platonic anamnesis and Hegel's Erinnerung that can be, of course, recovered. I don't know if I got you right. Let's try to see how things work by mentioning, for example, the passage from certainty to perception. And I wonder, do we really need someone who is already arrived at the point of view of science in order to realize this passage? Or do we really need to presuppose absolute knowledge to understand what's going on in this passage? I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if it is really this is really your claim. But let's see how things work. The object of perception is produced by the process of immanent analysis of the structure of sense certainty, which explains the nature of its object. And at the end of the phenomenological investigation that makes explicit the structure of the object of sense certainty, this object no longer appears only an immediate object, but as we know, it turns out to be an universal. Okay. So I wonder, why do we need the for us perspective to move on to perception? We don't need it for the production of this new object, but we need it because sense certainty does not change. It does not adjust itself to a new object. Sense certainty remains fixed to its own criterion of truth. It remains fixed to immediacy. And so sense certainty fails to assume these internal mediation that are implied in its own knowledge of the initial immediate object. So sense certainty fails to assume the new object that it creates, namely this universal. So we could say the sense certainty fails to assume this new truth. Sense certainty remains sense certainty, and by itself it does not change into a new form of consciousness, but it is we, the phenomenologists, who pass to a new form of consciousness capable of assuming this new object, this new truth. But it is a truth, it is a new object that we do not produce. It is a new object, that is a new truth that we find as a result of the immanent analysis of the content of the previous form of consciousness, sense certainty. Okay, I wanted to quote a passage from Holgate's introduction of the Phenomenology, because I think that Stephen is much more clear than me, but I will skip that. And to sum up, I just want to say that I think that your idea to lose the learner paradox totally works, but I don't know if I have completely understood your way out of the paradox, which is to require the phenomenologist that is supposed to be the bearer of absolute knowledge as someone moving it's someone like moving the thread of the dialectic of the different shapes of consciousness. So each consciousness produces a new object that needs to be overcome. But this occurs not because there is a phenomenologist who guides it, but because every shape of consciousness has a content that is in itself limited. And the phenomenological investigation starts from this content and its clarification. Simply said, I could say that I don't see in the phenomenology a guide, something having an absolute truth, which consciousness needs to learn. I prefer consider the phenomenologist a kind of therapist that makes explicit the limit of each form of consciousness. And then I go on with the second talk, which is Emmanuel one, and thank you, Emmanuel. I'm really sympathetic to the idea that Hegel have two phenomenologies, let's say. Simply said that we have two phenomenological projects with two distinct functions. So I'm sympathetic to this idea of that we have two phenomenological projects. the Jena Phenomenology, the Encyclopedia Phenomenology, actually the only thing that seemed problematic to me in your talk is when you quote Derrida, but then I should say that I don't agree with Derrida and not with you. And especially when you say that each of the two, the phenomenology and the logic, develops and presupposes each other. But then I think this claim can be problematic depending on the relation of presupposition that is going on between the phenomenology and the logic. But this is a point that is addressed precisely by Federico's talk. So I just say that I agree with Federico on this point. Okay. But I would like to know something more about the second part of the paper, and more precisely about the proximity of the content of the two phenomenologies. How the similarity does not necessarily imply the fact that the two phenomenologies are one and the same project. And so why the similarities does not prevent the two phenomenologies from maintaining a different status and a different function with respect to the system. And of course, today, just in 20 minutes, you could not go into more detail in relation to this point, but I would like to know something more about not only the similarities, but also the difference, the structural difference between the two phenomenologies. And I made 3 pages of annotation about that, which I will not mention. I will just ask you to think about why, especially why the religion, spirit, and especially the religion and the absolute knowledge section are not there. For me, it is really important to think of phenomenology as these two movements, structured on the base of these two movements, the one from conscience to spirit, and the other within religion. We have these two movements, the first one through which we have a consciousness that develops, until it reaches an absolute form, and we have the religious, the religious section through which the absolute object, we have an object that turns out to be an absolute object, and ends up being an object that recognizes itself in consciousness. And then in absolute knowledge, we have the integration of these two movements. This is not present in, this is a structure that is not present at all or at least I don't think so, in the Encyclopedia Phenomenology. And maybe this is the key point to highlight the difference of the two phenomenological projects. Okay. Then Federico, thanks so much for your paper. I basically agree with you. I just have one question and a general remark. I just want to ask if saying that the phenomenology presupposes the conceptual element is necessarily the same. It's equivalent to say that the phenomenology presupposes the logic. I'm not sure about this. I didn't notice this point by reading your paper, but then during your talk I was wondering, is it really the same? Is there not a conceptual element in the Jena phenomenology independent on the logic? Don't know. And okay, and some general remarks. It's my problem is I would like you to solve some of my problem with Hegel's conception of science, because I think that this is an implication of what you claim in your talk. And so it's a problem that deals with Hegel's conception of philosophy as science, how this conception of science works in the passage from the phenomenology to the system. And especially for me, it's particularly relevant, the possibility of an actualization of this conception of science. And at some point in your paper, you say, since Hegel admits that the phenomenological investigation is itself a science, this opens up the paradox of a science before the science, thus the issue of circularity. And the way out of the paradox, I think this is resolved through the explication of the different meanings of the word science and the different meaning of the word presupposition when you consider the relation between the logic and the phenomenology. And then you say, later you say, and I quote your paper, we should pursue a virtuous kind of circularity between the phenomenology and the science of logic. And a virtuous circularity means a dynamic or self-constituting circularity expressing the truth, or better, the togetherness of certainty and truth, as a process of self-constitution actualizing the object and in the subject of knowing without any subjective imposition or external presupposition. And about this later circularity, this virtuous circularity, and how it needs to be understood, you claim that if a circle is not a state, but an internally teleological movement, then it cannot be a seesaw, a coming and going from one term to another. Instead, it must involve a transition toward the science of pure form. Okay. The virtuous circularity as state characterizes the Hegelian concept of science, and in particular, as we have seen, the relationship between phenomenology and the system. And reading your paper, I was thinking about some books and papers that I've been reading during the last year when I was working on the relation between Hegel and contemporary metaphilosophy. And my question, and the question of everyone dealing with Hegel's metaphilosophy, is really simple, and it is the following. Where do we meet the concept of philosophical science in Hegel's work? And there are some interpreters who deny that we can find a metaphilosophy in Hegel's project. Others interpreters look for a Hegelian metaphilosophy in the phenomenology, because in the phenomenology we can find the deduction of science. And for other interpreters, this kind of metaphilosophical reflection can be found in the system. And I put myself in this group of interpreters. But I want to ask you, how would you approach the problem of identifying the Hegelian treatment of the concept of philosophy as science when you consider the dynamic of virtuous circularity between the phenomenology and the system that you presented in your talk? And another very general comment, which deals with a possible actualization of the Hegelian conception of science, and the way you highlight the circular structure of Hegelian concept of science. And I was thinking that normally contemporary philosophy look at Hegel's concept of science and of the circular character through which philosophy as a science comes to be constituted. And contemporary philosophy looks at this circular structure as a vice, as a defect of Hegelian philosophy, as a kind of out-to-date feature of Hegelian philosophical proposal. And I think that the way in which you describe this circularity and its virtuous character seems to allow to rethink of circularity from a contemporary perspective in a completely different and new terms. And so I just want to ask you if you think that it is possible. So if we can consider circularity not only as a vice for a philosophical system, but also as a virtue, also in a philosophical perspective, or if we can just consider this virtue circularity as a specific Hegelian feature that we need to attribute to Hegel and live just with Hegel without trying to actualize it. Okay, then I think the fourth talk was Rob's one. Thank you so much, Rob. I really enjoyed your paper. Actually, most of my comments were focused on the first part of the paper, so on circularity and on completeness, because I'm kind of obsessed with that. But maybe I can leave that to the rest of the discussion. Maybe we have time, or I will write you to ask more about this. And I just want to ask you a couple of questions. One point that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, because you seem to attribute to Hegel a kind of foundationalism. But you said that, of course, that it is a controversial point, right? The problem here is that foundationalism and especially the idea of one single foundation implies, as you said, the risk of founding the system on an unstable ground. And I believe that Hegel tries to solve this problem, but he does that by building an anti-foundationalist foundation. That is a foundation that has a different status from the one single foundation of Reinhold Fichte, etc. So I do not know if, in this sense, I'm following the interpretation that you mentioned in your paper, the interpretation of crimes, and even if I understand that you could analyze this. Of course, you could not analyze this in more details today, but maybe you can still tell us something more about this point, about this problematic point. So in which sense Hegel is a foundationalist? I think this is important to clarify this point, and that this is important to specify in which sense you attribute this thesis to Hegel. In fact, the very fact that the concept is a kind of anti-foundationalist foundation, that is to say, it is a foundation that has a circular structure, a circular structure that is important for your reading, is that kind of guarantee of the stability and security of the foundation that Hegel is proposing. And then I think it is particularly important to try to clarify what you mean when you say that Hegel is a foundationalist. Okay, and then I leave aside all my comments about completeness, but I just go, I want to quote one passage of your paper, which I think deals with the very last part of your talk, and is when you say, you mentioned paragraph 78 of the Encyclopedia. And so you try to present an implicit critique to Hegel, new presentation of the beginning. And you say, when he goes on to say, what he goes on to say appears to coincide roughly with the argument from the greater logic, to the effect that the concept of pure being might be understood as the unification of the result of a presupposed mediation, specifically an argument which would truly eliminate dogmatic presupposition about thought and the consequent immediacy or presuppositionless of thought. And then you say, you say. One difference is that the mediation in question here is not explicitly identified with the argument of Hegel's phenomenology, but with that of a negative science of accomplished skepticism. The more significant difference, however, is that Hegel here appears to roll back on the significance of understanding pure being in terms of the unity of the determination of the determinations of mediation and immediacy in this sense. And I think that at this point, if I got you right, is the starting point of your critique. And I was reading this part of your talk, and I was trying to understand what Hegel means by accomplished skepticism here. And I think my doubt is that when Hegel says here, when Hegel used the expression accomplished skepticism, I'm not sure he's referring to the understanding pure being in terms of the unity of opposite determinations that are the determination of mediation and immediacy. But I was thinking that he's referring to the radical suspension of each kind of presupposition. And in fact, when Hegel mentions the consummate skepticism in his remarks, he says, and I quote, "The demand for such a consummate skepticism is the same as the demand that science ought to proceed by doubting everything, by the complete absence of any presupposition. This demand is actually fulfilled in the resolve to engage in pure thinking and thought, the freedom that abstracts from everything and grasps its pure abstraction, the simplicity of thinking." Okay, I'm not sure my doubt, if my doubt is clear, but just if you can go back and say something more about this point. And thanks so much. And finally, Martina, it was great to read Martina's paper because actually I wrote a paper which some years ago, which is not as good as Martina's one, and which I sent to Martina yesterday, just to say, let's see, maybe I hope we are right. Okay, and even if we wrote a paper which in general goes to the same direction, I still have some questions, some remarks. So I completely agree with your project in which you try to highlight this convergence in the dynamic, logical dynamic and psychological dynamic. Okay. But my question, a very simple but also very difficult one, is why that? Where do we gonna go with this comparative analysis? In my case, I sent you the paper, as you saw. I was trying to use the psychology, and especially the passage on Erinnerung, in order to highlight how the Erinnerung from being into essence works. And when I was reading your paper, I was wondering, is she using the logic to clarify how the psychology works, or vice versa? Is she using the psychology to clarify how the logic works, or is she trying to do both things? And then I just want to give a suggestion to because I stopped at one part of your paper and I found what was the solution of the problem, but I don't know if it really is, if it really works. When you say, and I quote your paper, Hegel has been accused of being an enemy of reality and senses in favor of thought and ideas, as if the concept or the absolute had simply erased the previous stage of appearance and sensible reality. And I was thinking that maybe you could use your reading of logic and of psychology, and in particular your reading, your interpretation of the role of reflection in essence and representation in the psychology, precisely to attack this kind of readings. Because I think that having an enemy is always a good way to make our argument stronger. Okay, but this is just a suggestion. I don't know if it can work, and I just want to know what you think about that. Okay, another point on the convergence between the logic and the psychology, when you say, and I quote the paper, let us begin with the logic of the essence and explain firstly how being the previous sphere gets sublated into essence. This passage is in fact extremely important for our comparative work. Okay, but when in the following part of your paper, actually, you don't really go in many details when you realize the dialectical passage from being to essence. You dedicate much more space to the dialectic of the determination of reflection, and I really didn't understand this choice. And moreover, I think that a higher focus on the arena room process maybe could have been more effective in highlighting the conversions between the logic and the phenomenology. Okay, and I just skip another point, and I just want to go to a very general but also technical remark on the dialectic of the doctrine of essence. My impression, but I'm not sure I'm right, is that for you essence is structured on the basis of a kind of progressive movements, going from an internal reflection to an external reflection, followed by another internal reflection, and so on. And I didn't quite understand if you took this reading from Michael Pante, but it is as if the essence were constituted on the basis of an instability between internal and external reflection. I'm not sure if I got this point right, and I would like you to tell some more about this dynamic, so the dialectic of essence, which seems to be one of the fundamental points of your paper. Because understanding this dynamics that goes from an internal reflection to an external reflection, which is again overcoming an internal reflection, it's something that, at least for me, becomes more difficult, especially when you analyze the determinations of reflection. In this part of the doctrine of essence, so in the determination of reflection, I think that more than an instability between internal and external reflection, it seems, at least for me, that we have a passage that starts from positive reflection, that passes through external reflection, and ends up with a determining reflection. First of all, we have the positive reflection with essence that posits itself as identical to itself, but in as much as essence posits itself as identical with itself, essence also posits itself as different from itself, for the reason that you well explain in your paper. And then we have the external reflection, which is at play between likeness and unlikeness. And thirdly, we have the moment of determining reflection when we enter in the dialectic of the determination of opposition, which finds its culmination in the determination of contradiction. And it is in this sense that I don't understand why, how it works, this dialectic that you describe as a constant back and forth between internal and external reflection. Because it seems to me that we have a more complex movement that goes towards a progressive integration of opposite moments. And we run the risk to lose this progressive integration if we use this terminology of back and forth movement between external and internal reflection. Okay, and I think I will skip the last one, and I'm really curious to know what are the answers for my question, and it would be so much interesting because I also realized that your papers really enters in an interesting dialogue between each other. And so thank you guys for the opportunity, and thank you again, Luis, for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor Michela, for the enriching remarks. I think we can begin with Ms. Feng. Ms. Feng, you have a couple of minutes to try to reply to some of the professor's remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much for the thought-provoking comments, and which concerns really the crux of my argument. That is to say, the dynamics of the self-examination of consciousness. And your comment is major concerned with the role played of the we, this perspective we of phenomenologist. That's the role of Feng. And I think you are right to point that it is not necessary to dig such a gap between the Fengs, and you provide a very instructive way to relativize the role of the we by, if I've understand correctly, by distinguishing between the appearance of the new object and the adjustment of the consciousness. That is to say, the new object of consciousness comes from the reversal of consciousness itself, while it does not necessarily turn to the new form of consciousness, and that comes the role played of phenomenologist. And as a matter of fact, this point, my emphasis on the Fengs comes from the thesis of Hippolyte, and dans his commentary to phenomenology, he emphasized this distinction, and I think this distinction might be associated with other philosophers of German idealism. That is to say, Fichte, for example, dans his Versuch einer neuen Darstellung der Wissenschaftslehre, he presents two sequences. That is, one, the sequence observed by the philosopher, and the other, the sequence of the philosopher. Or Schelling, dans his Bruno, he described two words. One word is the word of finite, and the other word is word of infinite. And he thinks that the enterprise of idealism is to combine these two words, combine infinite and definite. And I don't know if it is necessary to introduce this line of thoughts, because if we might be too burdened with this ontological convictions or metaphysical traditions. But it seems to me that at least it might be a explanatory source to clarify the various relationships in the phenomenology. That is to say, that between individual and
and the universal between consciousness and the spirit, and between we, the phenomenologists, and the consciousness. And also another point concerns the text, because my research focused mainly on the introduction of the phenomenology, but it is not necessary that the corpus of the work obeys strictly what Hegel describes in the introduction. That is to say, in introduction, Hegel points out that it is the reversal of consciousness that brings out the new object. But if we really look into the text, for example, from sensuous certainty to perception, it might be that the change does not come from that way. And I think I cannot give a response, clear response. And I think thanks for your comment. I think I would work more to further to the textual details to look into the change between these two moments of form of consciousness, to see if the movement of consciousness really corresponds to what Hegel describes in his introduction. And that is my response. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Feng. Now I can give the word to Mr. Chaput. Are you still there? I'm not seeing you. You have a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you for your comments, Professor Bordignon. So I'll try to answer in order. The first, I think, comment was on the affirmation that the logic would presuppose phenomenology and vice versa. And I think on that topic, I'm basically in agreement with Professor Orsini to see it as a virtuous circle, in which we must distinguish the meaning of what presupposition means here. And so, of course, the idea of the phenomenology as a propedeutic will be a presupposition in the sense of establishing a necessary access by kind of overcoming the obstacle which is faced by natural consciousness when it attempts to bring itself to the level of philosophical thinking. But of course, as natural consciousness is an expression of spirit and so on, it still relies on basic logical categories which are only truly logically established within the logic, and in a sense it's a virtuous circularity, because not only we have through phenomenology and access to logic, but with logic we discover that natural consciousness as in itself the possibility of overcoming its own limit, and to discover the truth that is implicitly present, yet ungrounded in his apprehension of the world. And so it's kind of a deconstructing process, but also something that allows us to see what natural consciousness is capable of by going to the level of philosophy. So that's the first answer. The second is, of course, more complicated, more complex, the structural difference between the two phenomenologies. Well, first, I think one of the participants, I can remember which said, and this particular to the Jena phenomenology, that we begin with what seems to be a theory of consciousness and self-consciousness and so on, but at the end we we have a book that is far more a theory of the spirit, Phenomenology of Spirit. And so, which is interesting because in the Encyclopedia Phenomenology, there will be no question of well, there's not, spirit belongs to the sphere of psychology. And so we have more, far more restricted attempt to develop a theory of consciousness here in the Encyclopedia. And so all the elements which pertains to, for example, moral or objective spirit, which are present in the Jena phenomenology, will be, in a sense, discussed in philosophy of right, for example, and for religion, which was named by the Professor Bordignon. Of course, it's apprehended in the absolute spirit section of the Encyclopedia. And so in a sense, we can see that there is this formal structural difference is based on the intention of having only a theory of consciousness in the Encyclopedia for the phenomenology. But of course, it's not, my argument would not be that merely Hegel would have kind of cut out his Jena phenomenology in pieces and integrated them in different places of an encyclopedia. I think the idea that this is a deconstructive process which attempts to kind of deconstruct the a priori or the preconception of natural consciousness explains why we can have a reflection on history, on religion, on what is knowledge throughout the phenomenological process in Jena, because as we get toward a more complex understanding of what is the underlying ground of our natural knowledge, we are bound to be confronted with such phenomenon as society, history, and of course religion, which is for Hegel this kind of self-reflexive apprehension of the absolute in a representative fashion. So I think it makes sense and to treat such elements in the Jena phenomenology, but of course it makes no sense in the Encyclopedia. But of course my paper was more of a, well, open to more question than it actually answered, of course. But yeah, I think we can see this kind of structural difference because of the goals assigned to both phenomenology, which are radically different. Yeah, so that would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chaput. Professor Orsini, I think it's your turn. You have 5 minutes.
Sure. Michela, thank you for your question, remarks. Your question is whether the claim that the phenomenology of spirit presupposes the conceptual elements and the claim that the phenomenology presupposes the logic are the same. And my answer is that they are not the same. And insofar as the logic is not exactly the same as das Logische, the logical element, because the logic is the methodical self-explanation of the logical element. And the logical element is the object and finally, eventually, the subject of the logic. But I would say that Hegel defends both claims because Hegel is committed to the claim that the phenomenology presupposes the conceptual element insofar as in the phenomenology there is a certain correspondence between some logical determination, so conceptual determination, and the object of consciousness. But this correspondence does not, which Hegel himself claims, does not mean that there is a mechanical one-to-one equality or one-to-one correspondence between the determination of the science of logic as the work of 1812, 1816, and the shapes of consciousness. So I don't think that there is a correspondence in a mechanical sense between the science of logic, which is a posterior work, and each shape of the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is a previous work. So, at the same time, I think that the Phenomenology of Spirit presupposes not also the conceptual element, but the logic. But in which sense? Not in the sense that the phenomenology presupposes the actual structure and method of the science of logic. No, in the sense that the phenomenology presupposes the standpoint of speculative science, which is the standpoint of the logic, as a goal that motivates the project of the Phenomenology of Spirit. So the Phenomenology of Spirit presupposes the standpoint of the logic, but not the structure and the method of the science of logic. Naturally, to say that, not natural, but I would say that the claim that the phenomenology presupposes the standpoint of the logic as a goal that motivates the project of the logic, which is the introduction to science, does not mean that this motivation should be confused with a predetermination or a previous foundation of the peculiar method of the logic of the phenomenology through the logic, because this would certainly lead to a vicious circle. So the end of the Phenomenology of Spirit is not given for free. It's not assured by an alleged already present method of the science of logic. This would be absurd. So the end of the phenomenology is not given for free, but must be achieved through the long and self-revising way of skepticism that is displayed by the phenomenology. So in virtue of its skeptical method and in virtue of its specific element, which is the self-transformation of consciousness into an appearance of spirit, the phenomenology must also be scientific and presuppositionless, although in a way that is different from the presuppositionlessness of the logic. So I think that both works are presuppositions, but in distinct ways. As far as your remark is concerned, I would say so that Hegel, which is a remark about the concept of science, and then the remark about the possible actualization. I would say the Hegel is a member of the modern project of making philosophy into a science. And the proviso that the standard of scientificity for Hegel is philosophy. It's not empirical science, it's not even rational physics, but the other way around. The standard of scientificity of physics and other sciences is philosophy. So this identity of philosophy and science in Hegel needs this important qualification. And having said this, we cannot say that this identity is a flat, simple identity, philosophy, science, in the sense that Hegel's concept of science is quite sophisticated. Because I would say also for Fichte and Schelling, and for the so-called German idealists. Sure. So my concluding thought is that for Hegel, science is said in many ways, just like being for Aristotle. So we have phenomenological science, which we have a science of science, which is the science of logic. We have real sciences, real philosophical science. We have formal science like mathematics and phenomenologia, and we have empirical sciences. So science is said in many ways, even for Hegel. And unfortunately, cannot add any my response towards on the topic of the actualization of Hegel's concept of science and the virtue of virtuous circularity. So that would be my response. Thank you, Michela.
Thank you very much, Professor. Please, Mr. Dunphy, it's your turn.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Thanks very much, Professor Bordignon. Lots to think about. I'll go backwards, but I'll do it quickly. So the comments about section 78 in the Encyclopedia, right? If I've understood you rightly, I'll address what I think are the claims you've made, and I'm sorry if I misrepresent what you said. I think there were two claims. The first one was you weren't really sure that the skepticism that Hegel talks about there is doing the same type of thing as the phenomenology was doing. I think, and the second one was well, what it achieves in terms of getting rid of all of these assumptions is done by abstracting from the decision to think purely. So the first one, what Hegel says there is that skepticism. Sorry, translating on the go. Skepticism as a negative science that goes through all of the forms of cognition could operate or offers itself as an introduction in which the nullity of all of the presuppositions would be demonstrated. That sounds an awful lot like, to me, like what the phenomenology is doing, going through all the forms of cognition and show and critically sort of dispensing with their assumptions on a certain reading of the phenomenology. So I do think that I can read this, sort of map this paragraph onto what's happening at the beginning of with what must the beginning of the science be made. The second thing is, and I didn't make this clear in the talk I gave, but it looks as though Hegel gives two reasons as to why this is an unhappy and superfluous thing to do, right? To have a skeptical introduction. The first one is the one I think you mentioned, right? Which is that, well, what it would do is, what such an introduction would do is it would get rid of all of the presuppositions, but you can just abstract from the presuppositions and decide to think purely. Of that one, I just go, I just don't think that's no good, Hegel, right? Because abstracting from things is not the same as showing that they are wrong, or demonstrating their incoherence or their nullity, right? So I don't think that an attempt to kind of put the weight on a decision on the part of the philosopher to think purely works. And I can say more about it. I'll move quickly. And the second reason, which I didn't mention at all, but I should have done, is that Hegel says, well, the reason why it's an unhappy and superfluous way to have a skeptical introduction is, weil das Dialektische selbst ein wesentliches Moment der affirmativen Wissenschaft ist, right? And that's the thing that I think is shows that he's just slipping back into his kind of pre-phenomenology attitude of going, well, skepticism is just the negative side of positive rational thought, and that's why. So because in the logical examination of the categories themselves, because that also functions as a critique of the merely negative sort of view of the understanding of each of those concepts, it isn't necessary to also do that critical work beforehand as an introduction. And I think maybe that's right. Maybe the logic is supposed to also function as a critique of just one-sided views of each of the concepts that it considers. But that doesn't mean that it's legitimate to begin that logic by just asserting that pure being is the right place to to start, without a kind of critical look at the assumptions of natural consciousness or everyday thinking beforehand. So I think that neither of those things that Hegel says here are as good as what he says in with what must the beginning of the science be made. I'll leave it at that. The other thing was about Hegel's foundationalism. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to all of that at the moment. What I think is whether you want to attribute to Hegel a foundationalism when he says the concept is the absolute foundation of all of the concepts I've looked at in the first two books of the Logic. Probably, or whether you want to say it's anti-foundationist, is probably going to depend on how you read the doctrine of essence and there are different relations between ground and grounding and what's grounded and things like that, and whether you think that he's still entitled to some version of a foundationalism on the other side of that. I definitely and there's another question, which is given that this is also supposed to be a metaphysics, if the concept is meant to ground the concepts as so there's a kind of foundationalism to the logic, does that mean that he's also a metaphysical foundationalist? And that's where somebody like Kreiners, who you mentioned, seems to disagree, or at least did in the book he wrote, right? I think other people, Bowman, maybe De Boer, would seem to think that Hegel is also a metaphysical foundationalist. It all kind of depends on what's meant by foundationalism in that case. I don't know whether that's what we would need to look at in order to know whether they're kind of substantive disagreements or whether actually they're just bickering about the terms. I think we have to talk about it more. I'm sorry I don't have a more satisfactory answer at the moment, but I haven't really made up my mind about whether Hegel's a metaphysical foundationist or not. But thanks. I'd like to talk more about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dunphy. Ms. Martina? I'm sorry, it's your turn.
So, Professor Bordignon, thank you very much for the remarks and the compliments. Your paper was, of course, better than mine, but it's very hard to answer the question about instability in such a short time. I will try. So, I did derive the concept from Michael Pantheon, paper that he wrote in 2017, and if I had a proper understanding of what he says, the instability consists in the contradiction of external reflection and in the destroying that the external reflection operates, because he says that external reflection destroys not only the determinacies, but also itself. So it destroys the very own nature of identity and difference, for example, which is to be into each other, so related immanently to each other, and it destroys itself, its original aim, which was the one of keeping them separated, because in keeping it separated, it relates them once again. So you're right when you say that reflection is actually more complex. So maybe I shouldn't have talked only of internal and external reflection, but what I meant was that the entire movement of reflection, so the entire course of the logic of the essence, is unstable because it doesn't find a final conciliation. It never finds a proper conciliation. It has to wait for the logic of the notion to arise. So we could say maybe instead of talking of a constant back and forth between internal and external reflection, we could say that there is a back and forth between the being almost there, almost in the notion, and still being led to an exteriority, some kind of external movement, external point of view that doesn't belong to the notion at all. So this is also why I chose to give such an example, the essentialities of reflection, because I think that it is quite clear in the passage to diversity, which I investigate a bit, how can I say, like, I talk about it more in my paper. I didn't have the time now. So I think it's clear what is going on there. Of course, I could have gone through different paths, such as the Erinnerung one. So I gladly accept your advice, because in the future, I am sure it's going to be super helpful for my research to investigate the Erinnerung more. I could have also talked, now that I think about it, about the relationship between form and content in the logic of the essence, for example, because as we know, representation also has an entire situation going on between form and concept. Yeah, plenty of possibilities. And to conclude, I also want to answer your question about my general intention. Why did I choose to speak about psychology and logic? And you answered like my question yourself when you said that I was trying to defend Hegel against misunderstandings, and that's exactly what I was trying to do, because a comparison helps to understand better not only the two members of the comparison, so logic and psychology, but it also helped, according to me, to shed light on this Hegelian lecture on this lecture of Hegel as a panlogist who refuses senses and experience and nature and so on. And if we see how logic actually works, how it is embodied in the ontological world and in the objective world, we understand that it is not an iron cage that we philosopher or thinkers impose on reality as something external or something ideal and conceptual and abstract. So I think that establishing comparisons between logic and other part of the systems helps to understand the very own core of Hegelian idealismus, so the identity between being and thought. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Barnaba. We have received a question from our audience. It's from one of our colleagues from Universidade de São Paulo, and he addresses Professor Orsini. And I would like to place this question, and then I will close the event. Okay? Just 1 second. His name is Regis Alves, and he asks the professor, he says, I'd like to hear a little bit more on the relation between circularity, between logic and phenomenology, and the dialectics of reflection in the doctrine of essence. Since Hegel speaks of circularity in the science of logic only in the absolute idea at the end, if I remember it correctly, it seems to me that reflection is akin to the phenomenology internal structure, but I can't see how it would be able to describe the relation of logic to phenomenology. Even if Orsini had not stated this, I would like to know what he thinks. Professor, I will paste the question in the chat, okay? But you can begin answering.
Well, the topic of your question is very broad. So, well, I was lose of sight the answer, but if I understood your question correctly, I would say that the circularity of the logic means that the logic is nothing over and above the concept, which means conceptual thinking, self-explication. Through these explications, the first thought, which is being assessed, turns out to be the last thinking, the last, which is the idea, in potency. And vice versa, the last, which is the absolute idea, turns out to be the full explanation, full explicitation. Hegel's term is explication of the first. So this is the dynamic of circularity. The circularity is not is not a theorem, a special theorem that or a posit of the absolute idea. It's not something that simply pops up in the chapter on the absolute idea. It is the dynamic of the whole science of logic. But I would add, and possibly this could be to clarify a bit your question about the phenomenology, I would say the circularity for Hegel is inherent to scientificity as such. And this is a Fichtean lesson that Hegel makes his own, where a form of knowing is not circular, is not properly a science, because science is a self-organized way of thinking without external presupposition. So I would say that both logic and the phenomenology are circular. I try to explain in which sense each is circular in its own element, because even in the phenomenology, the last is marks, which is the absolute knowing. Marks are returned to the beginning, which is the most immediate forms of knowing. So I would. This could be obviously disputable, controversial, but I would say that there is a circularity even in the Phenomenology of Spirit, not just a progression and not just a transition towards the sense of life. I think that even the phenomenology has its own circularity. But there is even a circularity between the sense of logic and the phenomenology in the senses that I try to explain, which is basically the idea of the idea that both the phenomenology of spirit and the sense of logic are realization of the idea of systematicity, each own in its own element, and in such a form that each science presupposes the other, without this being a vicious circle, which is a petitio principii, which is a grounding relation between science of logic and the phenomenology. I don't know if I have minimally clarified your question about circularity.
Professor, we have exceeded our time limit, so we won't be receiving any more questions from the viewers. I thank you all for the fruitful discussion and the roundtable. Michela would like to say something. Please, Michela.
Yes, just want to ask everyone, I would like also to remind of a call for paper of the journal of the Brazilian Hegel Society. And I put the link of the call for paper in the chat. And the title of the call for paper is Hegel through Women's World. And it will be a number dedicated to the scientific production of papers, translation, reviews, authored by women on Hegel philosophy, of course. So almost every one of you are welcome to submit the paper. Of course, I'm talking specifically to Jiahiu and Martina. And of course, Fabiana and all the other Brazilian friends. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to discuss with you guys. And I really hope to meet everyone in São Paulo as soon as possible.
I would like to add something to what Michela said. We will be sending you an email after the event with further information on the subscriptions, okay, on the paper submissions. So I would like to thank again Professor Kervégan and Professor Bordignon for honoring us with your contribution to the first day of the event. I also thank the presenters and the viewers for participating. And I think that's it for today. I would like to invite you all to show up tomorrow, and good evening. I hope you have enjoyed. It was very enriching.
Thank you, all of you.